You ever go through a breakup and suddenly it's like you never existed? They stop calling. They don't check in. They move on like you were just a pit stop on their way to something better. And you're left sitting there thinking, so how could someone who said they loved me act like I never mattered? Well, let me tell you something straight up. It's not because you weren't enough. It's not because the connection wasn't real. It's because you're dealing with a dismissive avoidant. And the way they process breakups is nothing like what you're used to. This isn't about blame. This is about truth. Because once you understand how a dismissive avoidant operates, how they survive by shutting down emotions, avoiding intimacy, and pretending the past doesn't hurt, you'll stop taking it personally. And when you stop taking it personally, guess what? You take your power back. When it comes to dismissive avoidance, understanding their emotional world is key to unraveling why they act the way they do, especially after a breakup. Unlike other attachment styles, dismissive avoidants carry a significant amount of emotional armor. This armor is their way of protecting themselves from vulnerability, pain, and the possibility of emotional harm. It's not something they consciously put on like a shield in the moment. It's a long-standing coping mechanism developed over years. This armor is built on the belief that showing emotion, letting someone in, or relying on others is dangerous. And this belief is rooted in their deep-seated fear of being hurt. For a dismissive avoidant, emotions are something to be feared, something that should be suppressed, buried, or ignored altogether. They often view emotional needs as a form of weakness or dependence. This belief doesn't just develop overnight. It's a response to early experiences, usually in childhood, where their emotional needs went unmet or were dismissed. Perhaps their caregivers were emotionally unavailable or neglectful, and over time they internalized the idea that it's not safe to rely on others. As a result, they become self-sufficient to the point of isolation. The world becomes something they must navigate alone because trusting others feels like an invitation to get hurt. This emotional armor isn't something a dismissive avoidant chooses to wear for fun. It's their survival mechanism. They may appear detached, independent, or even cold, but in reality, it's a defense mechanism that shields them from the emotional vulnerability that they find so terrifying. This means that when a breakup occurs, it's not just the relationship that ends. It's the dismantling of the very structure they've built to protect themselves. To them, a breakup is a confirmation of their worst fears, that emotional closeness leads to pain and rejection. When a dismissive avoidant acts like you never mattered, it's not because they don't feel anything. It's because they can't afford to feel too much. They are so used to bottling up their emotions and detaching from their feelings that the very idea of confronting the loss of a relationship is overwhelming. The pain is too much to bear, so they shut it down. They shut down everything. They shut down their attachment to you, their memories, their love, even their need for comfort. It's a defense mechanism designed to keep them from feeling the weight of rejection or abandonment, which they fear deeply. Now, imagine being in the position of someone who has this emotional armor, someone who struggles to access their emotions in healthy ways. Breakups are devastating, but they're also a trigger. When a dismissive avoidant experiences a breakup, they immediately retreat inward. Instead of confronting their emotions and processing the hurt, they withdraw further into themselves. They often avoid facing the emotional reality of the breakup, which makes it seem like they've moved on effortlessly or never cared in the first place. But the truth is, the emotional armor doesn't mean there's no pain. It just means they're refusing to acknowledge it. This pattern can leave the partner of a dismissive avoidant feeling unseen, unimportant, and ultimately rejected. The partner may be left to wonder, how can they just walk away like nothing ever happened? But the dismissive avoidant isn't walking away because they don't care. They're walking away because it's the only way they know how to protect themselves from feeling vulnerable. For them, even processing the loss of the relationship would mean confronting the very emotions they've spent a lifetime avoiding. It's an excruciating experience, one that they're not equipped to handle in a healthy, communicative way. So when you're dealing with a dismissive avoidant, especially after a breakup, it's crucial to understand this dynamic. Their emotional armor is not a reflection of their lack of care for you. It's a reflection of their deep internal struggle. They may appear as if they've detached without a second thought, but what they're actually doing is retreating into a familiar space where they feel safe from the chaos of overwhelming emotions. In their mind, if they can shut everything down and avoid dealing with the emotional pain, they'll avoid being hurt further. This defense mechanism is why a dismissive avoidant may not reach out for closure, why they may not try to fix things, and why they may act like you never mattered at all. It's not because they don't care, it's because, for them, dealing with the loss of the relationship would require too much emotional exposure, something that feels terrifying and impossible. Instead, they shut everything down because it's the only way they know how to survive. Understanding this is the first step to taking your power back. The more you realize that their behavior is not about you, but about their emotional limitations, the less personal the situation feels. And when you stop taking it personally, you stop questioning your worth, and you start focusing on your own healing and growth. When a dismissive avoidant goes through a breakup, their response can be confusing, hurtful, and difficult to understand. Unlike other attachment styles, dismissive avoidants tend to detach emotionally from their partners, often in a way that makes it appear as though they never cared at all. This behavior can leave the other person in the relationship wondering, how could they just disconnect so quickly? But the truth, their quick disconnection is deeply rooted in their attachment style and the way they process emotions, especially after a breakup. For a dismissive avoidant, the emotional distance they put between themselves and others isn't a tactic or a conscious choice. It's an instinctive response to an emotional world they find overwhelming and difficult to navigate. Their avoidance of emotional closeness often stems from early life experiences where their emotional needs were not met or were dismissed. As children, they may have learned that showing vulnerability or relying on others for emotional support led to disappointment, neglect, or rejection. Over time, they adapted by becoming self-reliant and pushing their emotions down, because it felt safer that way. This pattern of emotional self-protection becomes ingrained in their behavior as they grow older, and it affects how they navigate relationships as adults. In a romantic relationship, a dismissive avoidant might seem distant, detached, and even indifferent at times, especially when it comes to emotionally charged situations. They tend to downplay the importance of their emotional needs, often because they've internalized the belief that needing others emotionally is a weakness. This makes it incredibly difficult for them to fully connect with their partner on a deep emotional level. But this doesn't mean they don't care. The truth is, they might care deeply, but their fear of vulnerability prevents them from expressing it. They tend to avoid discussing emotions, particularly the difficult ones like sadness, fear, or grief, because doing so would require them to confront the very feelings they've spent their lives avoiding. When a breakup happens, the dismissive avoidance instinct is to disconnect as quickly as possible. This doesn't mean they don't feel hurt or sadness. It means they can't cope with the intensity of those emotions in a healthy way. Instead of facing the loss head-on, they shut down. They may suppress their emotions, rationalize the breakup, and convince themselves that the relationship wasn't that important. In doing so, they create a psychological barrier that prevents them from feeling the full emotional weight of the situation. The more they disconnect emotionally, the easier it is for them to convince themselves that moving on is the best option. In their mind, emotional withdrawal is a form of self-preservation, a way to avoid the overwhelming pain of loss and rejection. This quick disconnection can feel like a betrayal to their ex-partner. After all, it may appear as though the dismissive avoidant has simply moved on without a second thought. They don't reach out for closure, they don't try to salvage the relationship, and they often avoid any kind of emotional conversation. To the partner left behind, this can feel like they were never truly valued or loved in the first place. But the reality is that the dismissive avoidance behavior isn't a reflection of how much they cared. It's a reflection of their inability to cope with emotional vulnerability. When faced with the painful reality of a breakup, they retreat into their emotional armor to protect themselves from the pain they feel. This instinctive detachment after a breakup is also a coping mechanism they've used throughout their lives. Because they've learned to avoid emotional closeness, their immediate reaction to any emotional challenge, including a breakup, is to pull away. They don't reach out for support, they don't express their sadness, and they don't try to process the emotions they're experiencing. Instead, they compartmentalize their feelings and convince themselves that they're better off alone. This avoidance isn't an act of selfishness or indifference. It's simply how they've learned to manage emotional pain. Additionally, the dismissive avoidant may also fear that reaching out or trying to reconnect could expose them to even more emotional pain. They might worry that expressing their feelings or trying to fix things could make them vulnerable to further rejection or abandonment. For them, emotional intimacy feels like a risk, one that they're unwilling to take, even if it means letting go of something they once valued. They may avoid confronting their feelings because it feels like an emotional threat, and their automatic response is to shut down and move forward. The quick disconnection from a breakup is not just about protecting themselves from the pain of the loss, but also about maintaining control over their emotional world. If they allow themselves to feel the depth of their emotions, they risk losing control over their emotional state. For a dismissive avoidant, maintaining control is paramount. They fear being overwhelmed by their feelings, and they believe that emotional control is the only way to avoid being consumed by pain. The idea of feeling vulnerable, of needing someone, of reaching out for help, these things feel incredibly uncomfortable and unnatural to them. So when a dismissive avoidant acts like they've moved on easily or never cared, it's not because they don't have feelings. It's because their emotional processing is so different from others. They compartmentalize their emotions, avoid dealing with pain, and put up emotional walls to shield themselves from the vulnerability that comes with loss. In their mind, if they don't allow themselves to feel the pain, they won't have to face the emotional devastation of the breakup. It's not that they don't care. It's that they can't allow themselves to care in a way that would make them feel exposed and vulnerable. This is why they disconnect so quickly after a breakup. It's their way of protecting themselves from the overwhelming emotions they don't know how to handle. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone involved with a dismissive avoidant. Their emotional withdrawal is a defense mechanism, not a personal rejection. They're not acting out of malice, they're acting out of a deep-seated fear of vulnerability and emotional pain. And once you realize that, it can help you stop taking their behavior so personally. For a dismissive avoidant, the fear of vulnerability is one of the most powerful forces shaping their behavior in relationships. It's not just about disliking emotional conversations or avoiding deep intimacy. It's rooted in a deep-seated fear that opening up emotionally will lead to rejection, pain, or even abandonment. This fear often originates from early childhood experiences where emotional needs were either ignored or dismissed by caregivers, or where emotional intimacy was viewed as a weakness. Over time, the dismissive avoidant internalizes this idea, believing that showing vulnerability, relying on others, or expressing emotional needs will inevitably lead to disappointment or emotional harm. At the core of the dismissive avoidance behavior is the belief that needing others is dangerous. They associate emotional closeness with the risk of being hurt. As children, if their emotional needs were unmet or rejected, they quickly learned that they could not depend on others for support. Over time, this belief became ingrained in their emotional framework. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Because of this belief, dismissive avoidants often struggle to reach out for support, even when they are in pain, and they view emotional dependence as something to avoid at all costs. In romantic relationships, this fear of vulnerability can manifest as emotional distance, detachment, and an apparent inability to connect deeply. The dismissive avoidant may keep their partner at arm's length, avoiding situations where emotional intimacy might emerge. For them, intimacy is threatening because it requires opening up in ways that feel risky. It means exposing their feelings, their needs, and their weaknesses, things they've learned to hide or repress in order to protect themselves from the fear of rejection or emotional exposure. One of the most difficult aspects of being involved with a dismissive avoidant is the constant emotional uncertainty. They may seem to be fine one moment, but the next, they pull away without explanation, leaving their partner feeling confused, unimportant, and frustrated. This push-pull dynamic is rooted in their fear of vulnerability. On one hand, they crave the closeness that a relationship offers, but on the other hand, the closer they get to someone, the more their fear of emotional exposure intensifies. The idea of letting someone truly see them, their flaws, their fears, and their emotional needs feels like a form of self-betrayal. It's a feeling of being out of control, and that is something they avoid at all costs. The fear of vulnerability is not a conscious decision for a dismissive avoidant. It's a deeply ingrained emotional reaction that has been built over a lifetime. This fear operates on a subconscious level, so when they withdraw emotionally or shut down during times of stress or conflict, they often don't even realize they're doing it. It's simply the default coping mechanism they've learned to rely on to maintain emotional safety and control. For them, Maintaining emotional distance is an unconscious way of managing their anxiety around closeness and the potential for emotional pain. When they experience vulnerability, it can feel like a massive emotional burden. It requires them to expose themselves in ways that are uncomfortable and alien to them. Allowing someone to see their raw emotions, needs, or fears makes them feel exposed and unprotected. This is why a dismissive avoidant might avoid conversations about feelings, refuse to share their thoughts, or seem emotionally unavailable when their partner is trying to get closer. They're not doing it out of malice or disinterest. They're doing it because they are terrified of the emotional consequences of vulnerability. Another consequence of avoiding emotional healing after a breakup is that the dismissive avoidant may fail to see the emotional impact of their behavior on their ex-partner. In relationships, emotional connection is a two-way street. When the dismissive avoidant withdraws and avoids engaging with their emotions, they prevent their partner from fully understanding their feelings or gaining closure. This emotional stonewalling can create confusion and frustration for the ex-partner, who may feel rejected or abandoned. The lack of emotional engagement from the dismissive avoidant can leave their ex-partner with feelings of doubt, sadness, and even self-blame, as they may wonder why the dismissive avoidant didn't value the relationship enough to process the breakup in a more emotionally connected way. This lack of empathy or emotional consideration for the other person's experience can damage the dismissive avoidance relationships and leave them with a reputation for being emotionally unavailable or cold. The dismissive avoidance inability to heal emotionally after a breakup also prevents them from developing the emotional resilience that comes from learning to cope with loss. Emotional resilience is the ability to adapt and bounce back from difficult emotional experiences. It requires facing painful emotions, accepting them, and learning from them. For the dismissive avoidant, the emotional shutdown they engage in prevents them from developing this resilience. Instead of processing their grief, they bury it, which means they never get the chance to build the emotional strength and maturity that comes from facing adversity. This lack of emotional resilience can make it harder for them to navigate future challenges in their relationships, as they are unable to learn from past experiences and grow emotionally. Ultimately, the refusal to engage with their emotions after a breakup is a defense mechanism that keeps the dismissive avoidant stuck in a cycle of emotional avoidance. While this may offer temporary relief from the pain of the breakup, it prevents them from experiencing the emotional growth that could help them become more emotionally intelligent, self-aware, and capable of forming healthy, fulfilling relationships in the future. Emotional healing requires vulnerability, introspection, and the willingness to face difficult feelings. Until the dismissive avoidant is able to confront their fear of vulnerability and engage with their emotions in a meaningful way, they will continue to struggle with unresolved grief and emotional stagnation, preventing them from fully moving on from the breakup and building healthier emotional connections moving forward. In conclusion, understanding the behavior of a dismissive avoidant after a breakup can be both eye-opening and challenging. Their tendency to shut down emotionally, deny their feelings, and avoid vulnerability is not a reflection of how much they cared, but rather a deeply ingrained defense mechanism designed to protect them from emotional pain. While this pattern may offer them temporary relief, it ultimately prevents them from healing and growing emotionally, leaving them stuck in cycles of avoidance and emotional disconnection. For anyone involved with a dismissive avoidant, it's important to recognize that their behaviors stem from deep-rooted fears of vulnerability and rejection. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it does provide insight into why they act the way they do. The real work, both for the dismissive avoidant and for their partners, is in understanding these fears and learning to face the emotional realities of the relationship and the breakup. If you're the one healing from a relationship with a dismissive avoidant, know that your worth is not tied to their inability to connect emotionally. While they may struggle with processing feelings, that does not diminish the value of your emotions or the love you shared. As you move forward, take the time to heal, reflect, and understand your own emotional needs. And for the dismissive avoidant, the key to breaking free from these destructive patterns lies in embracing vulnerability, learning to sit with your feelings, face the discomfort, and allow yourself the space to heal. Only by doing this can true emotional growth occur. By confronting their fears and embracing the full spectrum of their emotions, a dismissive avoidant can move beyond the fear of vulnerability and begin to develop deeper, more meaningful connections with themselves and others. It's not easy, but it is possible. The journey may be difficult, but the rewards, emotional freedom, growth, and healthier relationships are well worth the effort.